In mid-February 2022, as tensions mounted between the US and Russia over Ukraine, Western media including the BBC, MSNBC and ABC News widely publicized images of Valentina, a 79-year-old Ukrainian woman learning to handle an AK-47, endearingly described as, quote, a granny with a gun, without noting that her training was conducted by the far-right wing extremist and neo-Nazi militia called Azov battalion. As early as 2015, Congress passed a spending bill that devoted hundreds of millions of dollars worth of economic and military support for Ukraine, which was specifically modified to allow that support to flow to the Azov regiment. Azov battalion was formed in 2014 during the Odessa clashes and saw its first combat experience recapturing Mariupol from pro-Russian separatists' forces. Azov was then incorporated into the National Guard of Ukraine, part of the armed forces that the United States has now given $2.5 billion to assist with fighting against pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. That is despite the fact that Azov's former commander once said the, quote, historic mission of Ukraine is to, quote, lead the white races of the world in a final crusade for their survival, end quote, in a, quote, crusade against the Semite-led Untermenschen. As reported by John Pilger in The Guardian, quote, like the ruins of Iraq and Afghanistan, Ukraine has been turned into a CIA theme park, run personally by CIA Director John Brennan in Kiev, with dozens of special units from the CIA and FBI setting up a, quote, security structure that oversees savage attacks on those who opposed the February coup. According to a recent Yahoo News report, since 2015, according to 5 former intelligence and national security officials familiar with the operation, the CIA is overseeing a secret, intensive training program at an undisclosed facility in the southern United States for elite Ukrainian Special Operation Forces and other intelligence personnel. The covert program, run by paramilitaries working for the CIA's Ground Branch, now officially known as Ground Department, was established by the Obama administration after Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014, and expanded under the Trump administration and has been further augmented by the Biden administration. Something else that is also going to shock you, as this is also other information that is not reported on the mainstream news, is that in a recent UN vote on, quote, combating glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other practices that contribute to fueling contemporary forms of racism, the only 2 countries to vote no were the United States and Ukraine. US arms have flowed to Azov. They have been pictured meeting with NATO and US military officials, and members of the militia have talked about their collaboration with American trainers. In 2015, the Daily Beast published an interview by the journalists Will Cathcart and Joseph Epstein, in which a member of the Azov battalion spoke about, quote, his battalion's experience with US trainers and US volunteers quite fondly, even mentioning US volunteers, engineers, and medics that are still currently assisting them today, end quote. A 2018 FBI affidavit asserted that Azov, quote, is believed to have participated in training and radicalizing United States-based white supremacy organizations, end quote. These include members of the white supremacist Rise Above movement, RAM or RAM, of Southern California, prosecuted for planned assaults on counter-protesters at far-right events, including the alt-right Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. Although the perpetrator of the Christchurch mosque massacre might not have travelled to Ukraine as he claimed, he nevertheless took inspiration from the far-right movement there, and wore a symbol used by Azov members while carrying out the attack. Politico reported that the foreign infiltration of the American white supremacist movement is especially concerning to a number of law enforcement experts who say the Biden administration is failing to utilize the most powerful tool at its disposal to enable law enforcement to monitor such groups more closely. Foreign white supremacist groups can be designated as foreign terrorist organizations, and providing, quote, material support, which is designated as a federal crime. January 5th, 2021, it was reported that to serve as under Secretary of State for Political Affairs, then President-elect Joe Biden would nominate Victoria Nuland, who had a complicated history of involvement in exacerbated tensions in Ukraine by aligning with far-right and neo-Nazi groups, in pursuit of the US and NATO's interest in the region. An article in Salon titled, quote, "Who is Victoria Nuland? A really bad idea as a key player in Biden's foreign policy team," end quote, explains. Who is Victoria Nuland? Most Americans have never heard of her because the US corporate media's foreign policy coverage is a wasteland. Most Americans have no idea that President-elect Biden's pick for Deputy Secretary of State for Political Affairs is stuck in the quicksand of 1950s US-Russia Cold War politics and dreams of continued NATO expansion, an arms race on steroids and further encirclement of Russia. In addition to serving as US permanent representative to NATO from 2005 to 2008, Nuland has also been a member of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. Putin has come to recognize that the United States and NATO have made use of Western NGOs and social media attacks, orchestrated from abroad under the pretext of supporting democracy, combating electoral fraud or the corruption of the targeted regimes, to catalyze uprisings such as the Color Revolutions and the Arab Spring. The leading NGOs include the NED, as well as the International Republican Institute and Freedom House, which are largely supported by government funds and billionaire George Soros' open society foundations. The NED, an organization often described as an accessory to American intelligence, and which has been financially supported by Richard Mellon Scaife, who has long-standing ties to the CIA and also funded the Heritage Foundation. The first president of the NED confessed to the Washington Post that, quote, "A lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA." Acknowledgement of America's actions has resulted in a growing worldwide trend of governments seeking to limit and delegitimize foreign funding to local NGOs, including not only Russia but also India, Ethiopia, Hungary, Qatar, Egypt, and Israel. At home, the United States' actions are excused for the perception that the imposition of democracy is not objectable because it is not just an American or Western ideal but a universal one. As indicated by Robert W. Merry in The Atlantic, given the sizable expenditures that go into such projects, such intrusion, quote, "is a foreign policy issue that deserves more attention than it is getting in American discourse. Even if these accusations were to be made public, the general view is, as Merry noted, that, quote, these NGO activists are merely doing what comes naturally to those who believe American democratic structures represent universal values that should be embraced universally throughout the world." However, numerous critics have confirmed that NGOs have, quote, acted as interest groups rather than promoters of universal standards, and as tools of US foreign policy rather than as local representatives of the, quote, global conscience or, quote, transnational civil society. The truth is that the US State Department cannot divulge what are covert foreign policy tactics, and the work of NGOs provide them plausible deniability. Putin argued that, quote, the US instigated color revolutions in the former Soviet region, using grievances of people against their governments in order to impose their values that contradict local tradition and culture. These efforts were directed against Ukraine, Russia, and Eurasian integration, end quote. Russian state media asserted that the American government had been spending millions of dollars in support of the revolution, and Russian websites were published with alleged proof of direct American involvement in the Euromaidan protests. The ousting of Yanukovych sparked a political crisis in Crimea, which initially manifested as demonstrations against the new interim Ukrainian government. Events rapidly escalated, which led to the installation of the pro-Russian Aksinov government in Crimea, conducting the Crimean status referendum and the declaration of Crimea's independence on March 16, 2014. The Ukrainian territory of Crimea was annexed by the Russian Federation on March 18, 2014, and the peninsula is now administered as two Russian federal subjects, the Republic of Crimea and the federal city of Sevastopol. Putin welcomed the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation by declaring that he, quote, was saving them from the new Ukrainian leaders who are the ideological heirs of Bandera, Hitler's accomplice during World War II, end quote. In the last several years, Russia has demonstrated a return to an assertive foreign policy through successful military interventions in Ukraine and Syria. In the Kremlin, Alexander Dugin represents the quote war party, a divisive within the leadership over Ukraine, known as quote Putin's Rasputin, is an occultist influenced by Aleister Crowley and the traditions of Nazism and cynicism, and aims to create a quote empire of the end times. He considered the war between Russia and Ukraine to be inevitable and appealed for Putin to start military intervention in the eastern part of the country. Quote, Ukraine as an independent state with central territorial ambitions, he warns, in the Foundations of Geopolitics, represents an enormous danger for all of Eurasia and, without resolving the Ukrainian problem, is in general senseless to speak about continental politics, end quote. It was due to Vladislav Surkov that several of Dugin's political projects got off the ground. During Putin's first 2 terms as president, Surkov was regarded as the Kremlin's grey cardinal, and having directed its propaganda principally through control of state-run television. Peter Pomerantsev, a vocal critic of Surkov and his influence on Putin, accuses Surkov of turning Russia into a managed democracy, and along with another critic, Khodorkovsky, termed Russia as, quote, postmodern dictatorship. Ned Rezknov of Think Progress and Adam Curtis in his BBC documentary called Hypernormalization have claimed that the unique blend of politics and reality devised by Surkov has begun to affect countries outside of Russia, most notably the election of Donald Trump in the United States. Curtis credits Surkov for devising a blend of theatre and politics to keep Putin and Putin's chosen successors in power since 2000. Surkov sponsored all kinds of groups, from neo-Nazi skinheads to liberal human rights groups, and even backed parties that were opposed to President Putin. But Surkov would let it be known that this was what he was doing. At the same time, Surkov writes lyrics for a rock group called Agatha Christie and essays on conceptual art. According to Pomerantsev, in an editorial for the London Review of Books, quoted by Curtis, quote, in contemporary Russia, unlike the old USSR or present-day North Korea, the stage is constantly changing. The country is a dictatorship in the morning, a democracy at lunch, an oligarchy by supper time. While backstage, oil companies are expropriated, journalists killed, billions siphoned away. Surkov is at the centre of the show, sponsoring nationalist skinheads one moment, backing human rights groups the next. It's a strategy of power based on keeping any opposition there may be constantly confused. A ceaseless shape-shifting that is unstoppable because it's undefinable, or indefinable. Surkov's strategy is one he refers to as non-linear war, whose underlying aim, according to Surkov, is not to win the war, but to use the conflict to create a constant state of destabilized perception. in order to manage and control it. In October 2016, Ukrainian hacker group Cyberhunter leaked emails and other documents alleged to belong to Surkov, which showed a direct Russian role in creating and directing the rebel uprising in eastern Ukraine in 2014. In 2011, then Russian president at the time had resigned Surkov to the role of Deputy Prime Minister for Economic Modernization. On the 20th of September 2013, after he resigned from his position under that president, Putin appointed Surkov as his aide in the presidential executive office, who became Putin's personal advisor on relationships with many countries. On the 17th of March 2014, the day after the Crimean status referendum, Surkov became one of the first 11 persons who were placed under executive sanctions on the Obama administration. In August 2014, Dugin called for a, quote, genocide of Ukrainians. During the conflict, Dugin also lost his post as head of the Department of Sociology of International Relations of Moscow State University in 2014, as the result of a petition signed by over 10,000 people. The petition was started after an interview with Dugin where he expressed his opinion on how to deal with Ukrainians, quote, to kill, kill, kill. There should be no more conversations. As a professor, I think so, end quote.